Judith Dunker, Lehman College, CUNY. I thank you for such a delightful, very, very informative, and very, very entertaining speech. I really enjoyed it. I have to say, I do not share your optimism for the end of the madness in Washington, D.C., and I'd like to ask if there's any possibility that there could be constitutional changes as a result of what we see and what we have experienced recently. Do you foresee any changes in the Constitution to address what we just experienced in the shutdowns, given, as you say, that there are demographic swings, and I think the demographic swings are creating the craziness that we're experiencing, and that's not about to change right now. So is there any, would you foresee an opportunity for changes, constitutional changes in that regard?
Thanks. Here's why I'm an optimist. Because we have elections, and we have fixed elections, and actually we hold elections come hell or high water. We hold elections in the middle of civil wars and world wars. Britain doesn't. Britain canceled all elections between 1935 and 45, but we have a fixed system. We have elections, and you can fool the people, you know, for some of the time, but long run you just can't. And yes, things might get worse before they get better, but eventually, basically, elections will require, right now we have one, in my view, we have two great political parties in the American constitutional tradition, and today one half of one of our two parties is insane. That's and I say this as a political scientist. I can give you data. You should read Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein's book. It's Even Worse Than It Looks is the name of the book. They talk about asymmetric polarization. I'll be happy to give you all sorts of data to support that. I know it's a provocative claim. It just may happen to be true. The Democrat Party in 1850s basically committed suicide because they simply went crazy about slavery. And they are the dominant political party in America. They win almost all the elections. You know, they're the overwhelmingly dominant party. And then because of this craziness, first secession and then sort of massive resistance to fair demands for liberty and equality, they are in the wilderness, the political wilderness, all the way until 1932. No Democrat after between Lincoln and FDR wins a popular majority. None. Not Hoover. Not Grover Cleveland. Not Woodrow Wilson. So in history, some parties have gone crazy for a time. That was a world where there was much less informational feedback loop. You know, today, instant polling, all the rest. Parties are going to very much find it in their interest to recenter themselves, because if they don't, the Republicans will lose the House even in an off-year election, even when they try to suppress the turnout. And even though the electoral map favors them for various reasons, having to do with urban parties having a disadvantage over parties whose membership is more widely geographically dispersed. So the Republican Party craziness doesn't survive. You just have to wait 6 years. It can't survive 6 years. It's possible they could win. Tea Party kooks could win in the off-year election and even a presidency, but no more after that. You just have to look at the fundamental demographic reality of, I mean, very bluntly, angry old, white men are going to die first, and they are. It's just, not because they're angry, but just because they're old, and that is the base of the Republican Party, and it's dying. It's why cigarette companies have to keep advertising, because they're killing their customers. More women are going to be voting than ever before. More non-whites. America will look increasingly like California. Even Texas one day will turn because of the Hispanic demographic population bomb revolution. Here, the man named Amartya Sen, he's a very great economist from Harvard. He won a Nobel Prize, and he pointed out, it's like a big, amazing fact. He said, no democracy has ever had a famine. Famines turn out not to be acts of God, but because they're about political things. Because a democracy is about how you actually allocate food when it's in short. So if you screw up Katrina, if you screw up Sandy, if you screw up the healthcare website, I'm trying to be nonpartisan here, but when you have sort of major screw ups, if you're basically saying crazy things all the time, eventually the people in a democracy punish you and they throw you out. And so long term, I'm optimistic just because you can't continue to have policies that really are seen now as really imbalanced by most Americans. Now that's the good news. The bad news is that for democracy long-term to work, ordinary people have to actually know something. They have to, be educated to a certain extent. Because if they're not, then all hope is lost. That's why, truthfully, I try to write books for people in AP history and AP government and not just for law professors and law students, because there are people in Texas who think actually that there's a right to secede, and nothing could be more clear than that the Constitution was actually designed for geostrategic purposes to prevent that. You didn't have to join, but once you're in, and Lincoln understood that. So in the end, I have a kind of optimist faith in the democratic project. We are winning in the world. The world is becoming increasingly American. Half of the world is democratic. That wasn't true in 1940. Definitely wasn't true in 1900. Not at all true in 1787. The world is becoming more democratic, and America is becoming more global. Because of immigration reform in 1965, inspired by Cold War imperative and foreign policy considerations, and we increasingly are the world. I think we need sane immigration reform, which in part requires us to focus a little bit more on the talents that people that would-be immigrants can bring, economic, entrepreneurial, intellectual capital, but actually, a lot of people around the world still want to come to the United States. This is a huge asset that we have, huge soft power. And just so we're clear, the place where North meets South and East meets West in the world, there are about 3 places: California and New York City. You see, you live in the capital of the world. This place will actually be an important engine of the globalization of America and the Americanization of the globe.
Be constitutional to have a national debt limit?
Have a national, well, we actually can pay all the actual debts of the United States many times over, even just from the money coming in every day. So we might shut down all sorts of other things that are necessary, school lunches and necessary health care. But it's not a debt that we owe. If some doctor hasn't even performed the procedure, he's going to do it tomorrow, she's going to do it tomorrow, but now she knows if she does it, she's not going to get paid on time. But we have more than enough money coming in every day to pay all the bondholders. So there's no, and this is actually what the Republicans say. So on this one, I'm actually saying there is no genuine a crisis of default for the bondholders, and the 14th Amendment is about the bondholders. So the money people will always get paid first for a whole bunch of reasons, and I'm completely comfortable with that. I understand that I'm in New York City, and so not to worry. Your money is safe.
A bright person like Ted Cruz.
Mm-hmm. That it's a big and diverse country, many subcultures. The South still has a different understanding of the Civil War. If you read Faulkner, he says, Requiem for a Nun, the past isn't over, it's not even past, the past isn't. So people in Texas actually are not taught some fundamental truths about, so let me tell you, how many popular votes did Abraham, not electoral votes, popular votes, did Abraham Lincoln get in 1860, south of Virginia? The answer is 0. The Republican Party was outlawed in the South far more than in the 1850s, far more than the communists ever were in the 1960s. Almost no one is taught that in school. I'm not making up those facts. The South made it a crime, a capital offense, to preach against slavery in the pulpit. The Reverend Daniel Worth in North Carolina, they're trying to actually extradite people from New York who had the audacity to speak out against slavery and endorse a book by a man named Hinton Helper called The Impending Crisis. So, but if you're not taught that in school, that basically, one part of the country and one party really went kooky for a while, and it's caused a civil war, and in its wake, we actually agreed to some basic things. If you're not taught that, then you may have a different. Rick Perry thinks somehow, he said that Texas, when it was admitted to the Union, was given a right to secede. No, it wasn't. And Lincoln actually talks explicitly about Texas in his address on July 4th, 1861 to Congress. But people aren't taught that. So it does begin with public school education. So I'm not going to say anything bad about Princeton, where he did his undergraduate work, or Harvard Law School, where he did his law training. Those are very fine places, but I think he got mistaught early on. Only one more? Then you have to pick the one.
My question is, vis-a-vis the changes, the demographic changes in the United States of America, and the disappointment of the majority of the United States citizens from what is going on in Washington and the way that this country is governed right now, do you see any possibility of a change of two factors? One, a change in the electoral system in this country, and the second one is a rise of a third political force.
Thank you. Chapter 10 of the new book is called Joining the Party, America's Partisan Constitution. And in Chapter 10, I explain why basically we have had a stable two-party system for the last 150 years. And once a stable two-party system is in place, it is almost impossible to dislodge. It will take the equivalent of a kind of exogenous shock, an asteroid strike of a magnitude of the sort that killed the dinosaurs in order to dislodge it. I explain a thing called Duverger's law, which is not like the Sherman Antitrust Act or Obamacare. It's a law, a regularity of political science, like the laws of supply and demand in economics. And it says that when you have only one party at stake, a governorship, we pick senators one by one, single-member districts for the House of Representatives, the presidency. When you have one party in long-term equilibrium, it's actually hard to have one seat, in long-term equilibrium, it's hard to have more than two parties. It's a musical chairs game where there can only be one more player than there are chairs, because basically votes for third parties in America, for reasons that I explain in this chapter, are pretty much wasted votes. So the two-party system is built deeply into the very architecture of the system. It's even like how they sit down in not just Congress, but every state legislature. There are two and only two parties, the same two everywhere. There's an aisle that separates them. There are all sorts of rules for every committee about how many seats the majority gets and the minority, and how many staffers, the majority party and the minority party, and the ranking member and the majority leader. So the parties can morph. Today's Republican Party is basically, the Confederacy. the party of Lincoln has become the anti-Lincoln party. So the two parties have flipped. If you look at the Electoral College map of 1896 and you compare it to an Electoral College map of 2012, it's almost identical. Almost identical, except the Republicans in 1896, won the coasts, and now the Democrats win the coasts. And the Democrats used to win the South in some parts of the Midwest, and now it's the Republicans. So the parties can evolve, they can shift, but you're going to have two parties. You just have, so there is no alternative, but I think for both of these parties, because the system doesn't work unless they're both actually offering genuinely viable alternatives. So there needs to be massive reform. I think it needs to happen more in the Republican Party. I think they need to actually change their primary process, because I have 3 students who are now in the United States Senate. Will be when Corey gets, I don't think he's been sworn in yet. But Chris Coons wins in Delaware because they ran Christine O'Donnell against him. And Michael Bennet wins in Colorado because they ran Ken Burke against him. And the Democrats won Nevada against Sharon Engel, and won Missouri and Indiana, all seats that the Republicans should easily have won. But in primaries, they voted out Richard Lugar, and they voted out in Indiana and Mike Castle in Colorado. And and what I just said, do you know the person who agrees with me most of all? Karl Rove. Karl Rove actually understands that the Republicans actually have lost a whole bunch of seats that they should have won because they've allowed their primary process to get pulled very, very far to the right. Now, they will figure that out. Elections are chastening events. You lose seats that you could have won if you had run someone in the middle. You keep losing that, and eventually Karl Rove manages to prevail within Republican circles. Karl Rove and I agree because we're both political science types. We're being counters. We can sort of count these things. So there are going to be two parties. A third party is basically, I think a pipe dream. But there can be all sorts of electoral reform. California moved to a different kind of primary system, actually, an open primary system. You could have rules about nonpartisan districting. You could have all sorts of changes in who gets to vote in primaries and how candidates are selected. You can have a whole bunch of you can have campaign finance reform of various sorts, genuine electoral reform. Yes, I'm for it. And actually, the Republicans are going to need to do more of this than the Democrats, because even if they can win the House, long term, they can't win the presidency going forward with their current coalition. And, the numbers don't add up unless they bring in new people, which will require a new platform. So two parties, we're going to have all sorts of electoral reform. We need some of it need not be done by law, but can be done by the parties themselves, and will be done if the Republicans actually are punished at the polls, either in the off-year election, which is hard to do because not so many people turn out and they've suppressed the vote in all sorts of ways, but in the next presidential election. If they lose that one, then they will have lost the popular vote in 4 of the last 5 or 5 of the last 6, and they will have powerful incentives to reform in the same way that when people start starving, democracies find ways to move food around, and democracies don't have famines.
Professor Amar, I'd like to thank you very much.